The laughter inside the Adebayo family compound grew louder as pregnant Oluwadarasimi struggled to carry her small suitcase down the marble steps alone. Her late husband's brothers stood beside the gate watching like strangers, while Madame Ronke pointed toward the street with cold hatred in her eyes. "You buried my son," she shouted. "Now leave this house before your child destroys us too." One servant threw Oluwadarasimi's baby clothes onto the dusty roadside, while neighbors whispered in shock. Then suddenly, the black SUVs arrived. The compound fell silent as a feared man named Jide Kosoko stepped out slowly, removed his dark glasses, and stared directly at the family. "Nobody humiliates her again," he said quietly. And for the first time that day, the Adebayo family looked afraid. If you're watching right now, tell me your country and local time in the comments. And if stories about justice, healing, and hope touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional African stories. 3 months before tragedy entered the Adebayo family, Oluwadarasimi still believed her life was blessed. Every morning in their modest Lagos apartment, she woke before sunrise to prepare breakfast, while soft gospel music played from an old radio near the kitchen window. The apartment was small compared to the luxurious mansions owned by the Adebayo family, but it carried warmth that money could never buy. The curtains smelled faintly of detergent and sunlight. The walls held framed photographs of happier years, and every corner carried traces of Tunde's quiet love. Tunde Adebayo was not like his wealthy brothers. While Femi and Kunle spent their days chasing contracts, expensive parties, and political connections, Tunde preferred simplicity. He hated unnecessary attention. He treated drivers and cleaners with respect. He still greeted security guards by name. That softness often made his family call him weak, but Oluwadarasimi loved him deeply for it. That evening, she stood in front of the mirror inside their bedroom, gently touching her growing stomach while adjusting the loose yellow dress Tunde loved so much. "You're smiling again," Tunde said from the doorway. Oluwadarasimi turned and laughed softly. "Your son has been kicking me all afternoon." Tunde walked toward her, carefully kneeling before her stomach with a dramatic seriousness that always made her laugh. "My son," he asked. "What if it's my beautiful daughter?" The baby kicked again beneath Oluwadarasimi's hands. Tunde widened his eyes. "You see, even the child disagrees with you." She laughed harder while he rested his head gently against her stomach. For a few seconds, the world outside disappeared. No family pressure, no business fights, no inheritance battles, only love. That was the memory that would later destroy Oluwadarasimi the most. Because peace always feels eternal moments before it disappears. Later that night, they sat together on the small balcony overlooking the busy Lagos streets below. Traffic lights flickered across the darkness while distant sounds of street vendors echoed through the humid air. Tunde looked unusually quiet. Oluwadarasimi noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly. He forced a smile. "Nothing. That's not true." Tunde leaned back slowly and stared into the distance. "My brothers are angry again," he admitted. Oluwadarasimi lowered her eyes. The tension inside the Adebayo family business had been growing for months. Their late father had built one of the largest transport and construction companies in Lagos. But after his death, greed quietly entered the family like poison. Femi wanted full control, Kunle wanted faster expansion and hidden deals with corrupt politicians. But Tunde kept resisting them. "They think I'm standing in the way," he said quietly. "You're protecting your father's company. They don't see it that way anymore." Oluwadarasimi moved closer and held his hand. "Then leave the company," she whispered, teared. "We don't need that kind of wealth to survive." Tunde smiled sadly. "You would really leave everything behind for me. I would leave everything behind for peace." For a moment his eyes filled with emotion. Then he kissed her forehead gently. "I promise you," he whispered, "no matter what happens, I will protect you and this baby." Oluwadarasimi did not know those words would become the promise that haunted her forever. 2 weeks later, Tunde traveled to Abuja for an emergency business meeting involving one of the company's government contracts. He kissed Oluwadarasimi goodbye before dawn. She still remembered exactly how he looked standing beside the apartment door in his navy blue suit. Still remembered the smell of his cologne. Still remembered the way he turned back one final time. "Don't forget your hospital appointment tomorrow," he teased. "And don't forget you promised to bring me suya when you return," she replied. He laughed. Done. That was the last time she ever saw her husband alive. The phone call arrived after midnight. At first, Oluwadarasimi thought she was dreaming because the ringing would not stop. When she finally answered, she heard confusion, shouting, and traffic noises in the background. Then a strange voice spoke. "Madam, there has been an accident." Everything after that became fragments. A damaged black SUV, broken glass scattered across wet asphalt, police lights flashing through darkness, someone saying the brakes had failed, someone else whispering that Tunde died instantly. Oluwadarasimi remembered screaming so loudly inside the hospital corridor that nurses came running from other rooms. But none of it changed reality. Tunde was gone. And the moment he died, the Adebayo family stopped seeing her as family. At the funeral, Oluwadarasimi sat silently dressed in black, while politicians, businessmen, pastors, and wealthy Lagos elites filled the church. Nobody spoke kindly to her. Nobody comforted her for long. Instead, whispers followed her everywhere. She brought bad luck. Tunde changed after marrying her. She trapped him with pregnancy. Even Madame Ronke Tunde's mother barely looked at her. Grief had hardened the old woman into something cold and bitter. During the burial, Oluwadarasimi nearly collapsed while watching workers lower Tunde's coffin into the ground. Her hands trembled uncontrollably over her stomach. Their child would never meet his father. That truth shattered her repeatedly every single hour. But worse pain was already waiting inside the family mansion. 3 nights after the funeral, Oluwadarasimi walked quietly through the large upstairs hallway, searching for water when she heard voices inside her late father-in-law's old office. The door was slightly open. She recognized Femi immediately. "We cannot allow her to touch anything," he said sharply. Kunle laughed softly. "She's pregnant, emotional, and alone. Nobody will listen to her. And mother, she already believes Oluwadarasimi caused Tunde's death." A long silence followed. Then papers moved across the desk. Oluwadarasimi stepped closer unknowingly. "We transfer the remaining shares next week," Femi continued. "Once she signs the documents, she leaves the house permanently, and if she refuses, another silence." This one felt darker. Kunle's voice dropped lower. "Then we make life impossible until she begs to leave herself." Oluwadarasimi covered her mouth instantly. Tears filled her eyes, not because of the inheritance, not because of the mansion, but because the family Tunde trusted was already erasing him like he never existed. Suddenly another sentence froze her blood completely. "The accident solved everything faster than expected," Femi muttered quietly. The room became silent again. Oluwadarasimi stopped breathing. Her heartbeat pounded violently inside her ears. For one horrifying second, she wondered if she had heard correctly. Then footsteps approached the door. She stumbled backward quickly before anyone saw her and hurried down the hallway with trembling legs. Inside her bedroom, she locked the door immediately. Her breathing became uneven. Her hands shook uncontrollably over her stomach. No, Tunde's death could not have been intentional. It could not. But deep inside her heart, fear had already entered. And from that night onward, Oluwadarasimi no longer felt safe inside the Adebayo mansion. The morning Oluwadarasimi was thrown out of the Adebayo mansion began with humiliation. Not violence, not screaming, Humiliation. She woke before sunrise after another sleepless night, her swollen feet aching as she slowly climbed down from the large bed she once shared with Tunde. The room no longer felt like hers. Since the funeral, every corner of the mansion had turned cold. Workers who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped whenever she entered a room. Even the air inside the house felt hostile. Oluwadarasimi stood quietly beside the bedroom window, staring at the massive compound outside while one hand rested protectively on her stomach. The baby kicked softly. A painful smile touched her lips. "At least you're still fighting," she whispered weakly. For several seconds she imagined Tunde standing behind her again, imagined his arms wrapping around her shoulders, imagined his calm voice telling her everything would be fine. But silence answered her instead. Then came the knock on the door, hard, cold, impatient. Before she could respond, the door swung open. Madame Ronke entered first, dressed in expensive lace clothing, her face carrying the bitterness of someone who had stopped grieving and started blaming. Behind her stood Femi and Kunle. Neither man smiled. Oluwadarasimi's chest tightened immediately. "Good morning, Mama," she said softly. Madame Ronke ignored the greeting completely. "You have overstayed in this house," she said flatly. Oluwadarasimi blinked slowly. What Femi stepped forward holding several papers. "You need to sign these documents," he said. "After that, arrangements will be made for you somewhere else." Oluwadarasimi stared at him carefully. "What documents? Property transfer papers?" Her heartbeat quickened. "These belong to Tunde." Kunle laughed quietly. "Tunde is dead." The cruelty in his voice pierced deeper than shouting would have. Oluwadarasimi looked toward Madame Ronke desperately. "Mama, I am carrying his child, and that child will not control this family," the old woman snapped immediately. The room fell silent. Oluwadarasimi felt her throat tighten painfully. For days she had endured whispers, cold stares, and emotional isolation while grieving her husband. But this was different. This was war. "I won't sign anything without reading it properly," she said quietly. Femi's expression darkened. "You are becoming difficult." "No," she replied softly. "I am becoming careful." Madame Ronke suddenly stepped closer. "Ever since you entered my son's life, there has been nothing but trouble," she hissed. He stopped listening to his family. He stopped trusting his brothers. And now he is buried. Tears immediately filled Oluwadarasimi's eyes. "You think I wanted Tunde to die? I think you brought darkness into this house." The words landed like blows. Oluwadarasimi stepped backward slowly. Her breathing became shallow. For a moment she could not even speak. Then she gathered the last strength inside herself. "I loved your son." Madame Ronke's eyes hardened even further. "Then go mourn him somewhere else." Two houseworkers suddenly entered the room carrying empty suitcases. Oluwadarasimi froze. No, this could not be happening. "Mama," she whispered weakly, but nobody listened anymore. The workers began pulling clothes from wardrobes. Shoes were tossed carelessly into bags. Drawers opened violently. Personal belongings crashed onto the floor. Everything she owned, everything connected to her marriage, being erased. Oluwadarasimi rushed toward the framed wedding photograph beside the bed before one worker could grab it. She held it tightly against her chest. In the picture, Tunde stood smiling beside her, beneath golden church lights, his hand wrapped gently around hers. That version of life already felt like another world. "You cannot do this," she whispered through tears. Kunle shrugged coldly. "You have no rights here anymore." The sentence shattered something inside her, not because of wealth, not because of the mansion, but because she finally understood the truth. The Adebayo family had already buried her together with Tunde. An hour later, servants carried her belongings downstairs, while neighbors gathered quietly outside the compound gates. Some watched with pity, others watched with curiosity. Nobody intervened. Oluwadarasimi walked slowly behind them, one hand supporting her lower back as pain spread through her pregnant body. The Lagos heat felt suffocating, her vision blurred repeatedly from exhaustion and grief. At the center of the compound, Madame Ronke pointed toward the gate. "Leave." Oluwadarasimi looked around desperately. "This is still my husband's home, not anymore." Femi opened the compound gate aggressively. Outside traffic moved through the busy street while people slowed down to stare. The humiliation became public instantly. Kunla tossed her suitcase onto the dusty roadside. One bag burst open on impact, spilling baby clothes across the ground. A tiny pair of socks rolled into dirty water near the gutter. Oluwadarasimi stared at them silently. Then something inside her finally broke. Slowly, painfully, she bent down despite her pregnancy and picked them up with trembling fingers. Tears dripped onto the fabric. The crowd whispered quietly around her. "She's pregnant. Ah, this is too much." After her husband just died, but sympathy changed nothing. Madame Ronke folded her arms. "You should be grateful we allowed you to stay this long." Oluwadarasimi stood again slowly. Her face looked pale beneath the harsh sunlight. "You will regret treating Tunde's child this way," she whispered. For 1 second, uncertainty crossed the old woman's face. Then it vanished. "Go." And the gates slammed shut. Just like that. Her marriage, her home, her family, gone. Oluwadarasimi remained standing outside the compound for several minutes, unable to move. Cars passed. Street vendors shouted nearby. Life continued around her while hers collapsed completely. Then suddenly sharp pain tightened across her stomach. She gasped softly and grabbed the wall beside her. Fear flooded her instantly. "No, no, please." The baby shifted painfully again. Oluwadarasimi closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe slowly. Stress, too much stress. She could not collapse now. She picked up her suitcase carefully and began walking. Hour after hour she wandered through crowded Lagos streets with nowhere to go. The few friends she once had belonged to Tunde's social circle. After his death, most stopped answering her calls politely. Some feared involvement with the powerful Adebayo family. Others simply disappeared. By evening, exhaustion consumed her completely. The sky darkened gradually while market traders packed their goods beside noisy roads. Oluwadarasimi finally stopped near a small roadside food stall. The smell of fried plantain filled the air. Suddenly, she realized she had not eaten since the previous morning, but when she checked inside her handbag, only a few naira remained. Not enough. Her eyes filled again. Across the road, a young couple walked past laughing together, while the man held his pregnant wife protectively. The sight destroyed her emotionally, because that used to be her life, before death, before betrayal, before loneliness. Oluwadarasimi sat slowly on a broken wooden bench near the roadside and finally allowed herself to cry openly. Not quiet tears, not silent suffering, real grief, the kind that shakes the body violently, the kind that empties the soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered repeatedly to the unborn child inside her. "I'm so sorry." People passed without stopping. Some stared briefly. Most ignored her. Then an older woman carrying a tray of vegetables paused nearby. Her name was Mama Bisola. She studied Oluwadarasimi carefully for several seconds. The swollen stomach, the expensive wedding ring, the exhausted face, the suitcase beside her feet, and the unbearable sadness in her eyes. Mama Bisola slowly sat beside her. "My daughter," she asked gently, "where is your family?" Oluwadarasimi tried to answer, but only broken sobs came out. And for the first time since Tunde died, someone finally looked at her with genuine human kindness. Mama Bisola lived in a narrow neighborhood behind Balogan Market, where the streets never truly slept. Even at midnight, voices drifted through the humid Lagos air. Traders argued over prices beneath weak electric bulbs. Motorcycle engines roared through crowded alleys. Somewhere nearby, loud music played from an old speaker while children chased one another barefoot between tiny roadside shops. It was nothing like the wealthy world Oluwadarasimi once knew, and yet strangely, it felt safer. Mama Bisola's home stood at the end of a narrow passage between two crumbling buildings. The small one-room apartment carried the smell of pepper soup, old fabric, and wood smoke. A single standing fan rotated weakly near the corner, while rain-stained curtains moved gently beside the open window. "It's not much," Mama Bisola said softly, while placing a thin mattress on the floor, "but nobody will chase you away here." Oluwadarasimi looked around silently, her throat tightened again. Since Tunde's death, kindness felt almost suspicious because cruelty had become more familiar. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Mama Bisola smiled sadly. "I know pain when I see it." Those words nearly broke Oluwadarasimi again. That night she barely slept. The baby moved constantly beneath her stomach while memories tormented her every time she closed her eyes. Tunde laughing beside the balcony, Tunde kissing her forehead, Tunde promising to protect her. Then suddenly, the image of his coffin disappearing beneath the ground. Oluwadarasimi turned sharply on the mattress and covered her mouth to stop herself from crying loudly. Across the room, Mama Bisola pretended not to notice. Some grief needed privacy. Morning arrived with exhaustion. Mama Bisola woke before dawn to prepare vegetables for the market. She moved quietly around the room while Oluwadarasimi sat beside the window staring blankly at the crowded alley outside. Women carried baskets on their heads. Street boys pushed carts filled with fruit. Vendors shouted prices loudly. Life moved forward no matter who was suffering. "You should eat something," Mama Bisola said gently. "I'm not hungry. That baby is hungry." Oluwadarasimi lowered her eyes immediately. Guilt flooded her chest. She placed both hands over her stomach protectively. "I'm trying," she whispered weakly. Mama Bisola handed her a small plate of rice and beans. "You survive one day at a time," the older woman said quietly. "That is how broken people stay alive." The sentence stayed inside Oluwadarasimi's mind long after breakfast ended, because she truly did feel broken now, not just emotionally, spiritually, physically. The wealthy woman who once attended charity dinners beside her husband now depended on a market trader for food and shelter. And worst of all, she still had nowhere to go. Later that afternoon, Oluwadarasimi attempted calling several old friends from Tunde's social circle again. Most numbers went unanswered. One woman finally picked up, but her voice sounded nervous immediately. "Oluwadarasimi, I heard what happened. Please," Oluwadarasimi whispered. "I just need temporary help until I can stand again." A painful silence followed. Then came the excuse. "My husband doesn't want us involved in family matters." The line disconnected seconds later. Oluwadarasimi stared at the phone silently. Another door closed. Across Lagos, inside the luxurious Adebayo corporate headquarters, celebration had already replaced mourning. Femi sat at the head of the boardroom table wearing one of Tunde's favorite watches. Kunle poured expensive whiskey into crystal glasses, while several executives laughed nervously around them. The brothers looked relaxed for the first time since the funeral. "To new beginnings," Kunle said proudly. Glasses clinked around the room, but beneath the celebration lived fear, because both men knew the truth behind Tunde's death, and guilt always hides beneath arrogance. "What about the shares?" one executive asked carefully. Femi leaned back calmly. "The widow has no power anymore, and if she talks," Kunle smirked. "Nobody listens to emotional pregnant women." Laughter followed, but not everyone inside the room laughed. At the far end of the table sat an older accountant named Mr. Adewale, quiet, watching, sweating slightly, because unlike the others he remembered exactly what happened the night before Tunde died, and the memory haunted him. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, another man had also started asking dangerous questions. His name was Jide Kosoko. Across Lagos, people spoke his name carefully. Some called him a businessman, others called him something darker. Nobody truly knew how much power he controlled, because Jide operated quietly behind legitimate companies, political networks, private security firms, and invisible streets where rich men bought protection. He rarely appeared publicly, but when he did, powerful people paid attention. That afternoon, Jide sat inside a private office overlooking Victoria Island while one of his men placed photographs across a large wooden desk. Pictures of Tunde's destroyed SUV, pictures of brake reports, pictures of financial transfers connected to the Adebayo company. Jide studied everything silently. Then his eyes stopped on one photograph. Oluwadarasimi leaving the mansion carrying a suitcase, pregnant, alone, humiliated publicly. Something cold entered his expression. "Who ordered this?" he asked quietly. "We are still investigating." Jide leaned back slowly. "And the accident?" His assistant hesitated. "The official report says mechanical failure." Jide's eyes hardened immediately. "Official reports can be bought." Silence filled the office. Everyone inside knew Jide hated lies more than violence, because lies were what destroyed people slowly. Jide stood and walked toward the massive glass window overlooking Lagos traffic below. "Tunde saved my life," once he said quietly. No one responded. Very few people knew the history between both men. Years earlier, before becoming wealthy and feared, Jide had nearly died during a brutal gang conflict in Ajegunle. Most people abandoned him that night. Except Tunde. Young, stubborn, idealistic Tunde had pulled an injured stranger from the street and taken him to safety without asking questions. That single act of kindness changed both their lives forever. And Jide never forgot debts. Never. "Find the widow," he ordered finally. Back in Balogun Market, Oluwadarasimi's situation worsened over the following days. Stress drained her physically. Her feet remained swollen constantly. She barely slept. Sometimes she woke gasping from nightmares about Tunde calling her name from inside darkness. Other times she sat alone outside Mama Bisola's room, listening to distant church music while fighting thoughts of hopelessness. One evening, while helping Mama Bisola arrange vegetables near the roadside, Oluwadarasimi suddenly noticed something strange. A black car parked across the street. The windows remained dark. Inside sat two men watching her carefully. At first, she told herself it meant nothing, but the next morning, the same car appeared again. And the morning after that, fear slowly entered her chest. On the fourth day, one of the men finally stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, dark glasses. He pretended to buy cigarettes nearby while glancing repeatedly toward her stomach. Oluwadarasimi felt immediate danger. That instinct women learn when something is wrong, very wrong. "Mama Bisola," she whispered nervously. The older woman followed her gaze carefully. Her face changed instantly. "Go inside." "What now?" Oluwadarasimi hurried toward the apartment while Mama Bisola remained outside watching the strange men carefully. Minutes later, the black car drove away slowly, but fear stayed behind. That night, Oluwadarasimi could barely breathe from anxiety. "What if they came from the Adebayo family?" she whispered. Mama Bisola looked deeply troubled. Powerful families do dangerous things when money is involved. Oluwadarasimi held her stomach tightly. The baby moved again beneath her trembling hands. Suddenly a horrifying thought entered her mind. Not her, the child. Her unborn baby might also be in danger. And for the first time since losing Tunde, Oluwadarasimi truly became afraid of dying. Fear changes the way a person sees the world. After noticing the strange men watching her near Balogun Market, Oluwadarasimi no longer walked peacefully through the streets. Every passing motorcycle made her nervous. Every unfamiliar face felt dangerous. Even loud footsteps behind her caused panic to tighten inside her chest. And pregnancy made everything worse. She could not run, could not defend herself, could not even sleep properly anymore. That night, she sat awake beside the small apartment window while Mama Bisola slept nearby. Outside, Lagos breathed with its usual restless energy. Music drifted from distant bars. Street hawkers shouted through narrow alleys. Somewhere far away, police sirens echoed briefly before disappearing again. But inside Oluwadarasimi's heart, silence and fear battled endlessly. She rested both hands over her stomach. "Please stay alive," she whispered to the unborn child. Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks afterward. Not dramatic tears, exhausted tears, the kind that came when a human being reached the edge of emotional strength. Suddenly, sharp movement outside caught her attention. A shadow passed the window. Oluwadarasimi froze instantly. Then another shadow moved beside the building. Her breathing stopped. Carefully, she stood and stepped backward from the curtain. Someone was outside. Before she could react, a loud knock exploded against the apartment door. Mama Bisola woke immediately. Ali. Another knock followed. Harder this time. "Open the door," a male voice shouted. Oluwadarasimi's blood turned cold. Mama Bisola stood slowly from the mattress, her face filled with alarm. "Who is it?" she demanded carefully. "Landlord inspection." It was a lie. Everyone inside the neighborhood knew the landlord never visited at night. Mama Bisola exchanged a quick glance with Oluwadarasimi. Fear passed silently between both women. Another violent knock shook the door. "Open now." Oluwadarasimi instinctively covered her stomach. The baby shifted painfully beneath her hands. Mama Bisola moved closer and whispered urgently, "Go through the back." "What now?" The older woman grabbed her wrist and hurried her toward a tiny back exit, leading into a narrow alley behind the building. "But you—" "I said go." Another loud bang struck the front door. Wood cracked. Oluwadarasimi nearly cried from panic. Barely able to move quickly with her pregnancy, she squeezed through the back exit, while Mama Bisola remained behind. The alley smelled of sewage and wet concrete. Darkness covered most of the passage except for weak yellow lights hanging from distant balconies. Oluwadarasimi stumbled forward, breathing heavily. Then she heard the apartment door break open behind her, men shouting, furniture crashing, Mama Bisola yelling angrily. Oluwadarasimi pressed herself against the wall, trembling violently. Two men emerged suddenly from the opposite side of the alley, the same men from the black car. She recognized one instantly. Their eyes locked. "There she is." Panic exploded inside her body. Oluwadarasimi turned and ran, or at least tried to. Her pregnant body slowed every movement painfully. She clutched her stomach while forcing herself through crowded back passages behind the market. Footsteps thundered behind her. "Stop!" One man grabbed her arm suddenly. Oluwadarasimi screamed. Pure terror ripped through her voice as she fought desperately against him. "Please, please leave me alone." The man tightened his grip violently. Then a black SUV roared into the alley. Headlights flooded the darkness. Brakes screamed loudly. Before the kidnappers could react, several armed men stepped out rapidly, wearing dark clothing. Everything happened in seconds. One attacker reached for something beneath his jacket, a gun, but another man slammed him against the wall instantly. The second kidnapper tried escaping. He barely reached the corner before someone blocked his path completely. Tall, calm, wearing black, Jide Kosoko. The entire alley fell silent. Even the attackers looked terrified now. Jide removed his dark glasses slowly and stared at the man holding Oluwadarasimi. "Let her go," he said quietly. The criminal hesitated only briefly before releasing her immediately. Everyone in Lagos knew that tone. It belonged to men who did not repeat themselves. Oluwadarasimi collapsed against the wall, breathing uncontrollably. Jide glanced toward her briefly. His expression revealed nothing. No pity, no softness, only dangerous calmness. "Who sent you?" he asked the kidnappers. Neither man answered. One looked toward the ground nervously. The other remained silent from fear. Jide stepped closer slowly. "You entered my city," he said quietly, "and chased a pregnant woman through the streets." Still silence. Then suddenly one attacker whispered desperately, "We were only told to scare her." Jide's eyes darkened instantly. "By who?" The man hesitated again. Wrong decision. One of Jide's bodyguards struck him hard across the stomach. The attacker collapsed, coughing violently onto the dirty pavement. Oluwadarasimi flinched from shock. Fear shifted inside her chest again. Not fear of the kidnappers anymore, fear of Jide. Because now she understood the rumors were true. This was not an ordinary businessman. This was a man dangerous enough to make violent criminals tremble. Jide crouched beside the fallen attacker calmly. "Last chance." The man's voice shook badly. "We received instructions through someone connected to the Adebayo company." Oluwadarasimi stopped breathing. The Adebayo family. Dear God, the attackers truly came for her, or worse, for the baby. Suddenly, dizziness overwhelmed her completely. Her vision blurred. Jide noticed instantly. "She's collapsing," one guard warned. Before Oluwadarasimi could protest, darkness swallowed her briefly. When she opened her eyes again, she was inside the black SUV. Air conditioning cooled her sweating skin while soft instrumental music played quietly through hidden speakers. Mama Bisola sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "You're safe," the older woman whispered. "But..." Oluwadarasimi turned weakly toward the front seat. Jide sat facing forward silently while the city lights moved across the windows. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then finally, Oluwadarasimi gathered enough courage. "Why are you helping me?" Jide remained quiet briefly. When he answered, his voice carried no emotion. "Because Tunde once helped me." She frowned weakly. "My husband knew you." Jide nodded once. "Years ago, most people avoided him. Back then, he was still climbing out of violence, poverty, and dangerous streets. Powerful men used him for dirty work before abandoning him during a bloody conflict. Tunde found me dying," Jide said quietly. "He should have walked away, but Tunde stayed, protected him, saved him. And unlike many rich men, Tunde never demanded repayment afterward." Oluwadarasimi listened silently. A painful ache filled her chest, hearing her husband described that way. Kind, compassionate, human, exactly who he truly was. "I owe him a debt," Jide finished. Silence returned again. Outside Lagos, traffic crawled beneath glowing streetlights while rain clouds gathered above distant buildings. Oluwadarasimi stared through the window quietly. Her entire life had transformed into something frightening and unfamiliar. She had lost her husband, lost her home, lost safety, and now she sat inside a luxury SUV protected by one of the most feared men in Nigeria. Nothing about her life made sense anymore. Then suddenly another terrifying thought entered her mind. "What if they come again?" she whispered. Jide's eyes hardened slightly. "They will." Fear returned instantly. Oluwadarasimi grabbed her stomach protectively. But Jide looked at her directly for the first time, and despite the coldness in his face, his next words carried certainty strong enough to silence her panic briefly. "But they won't touch you again." For the first time since Tunde's death, Oluwadarasimi slept somewhere guarded, not peacefully, not deeply, but safely. Jide moved her and Mama Bisola into one of his private properties hidden inside a quiet area near Ikoyi. Unlike the luxurious mansions owned by politicians and celebrities, this house looked almost ordinary from outside. High concrete walls surrounded the compound, while armed security guards stood silently near the gates. Everything about the place felt controlled, disciplined, untouchable. Oluwadarasimi noticed immediately that nobody inside the house spoke loudly around Jide. Workers lowered their eyes respectfully whenever he passed. Even the guards stood straighter when his footsteps approached. Fear followed him naturally, and that frightened her. On her second morning there, Oluwadarasimi sat alone near the dining area, staring at untouched tea, while soft pain tightened across her lower stomach again. Stress. Too much stress. Mama Bisola entered carrying bread wrapped inside newspaper. "You barely ate yesterday." "I'm trying." "No," the older woman corrected gently. "You are surviving. There is a difference." Oluwadarasimi lowered her eyes silently. The truth hurt. Since losing Tunde, she had stopped living emotionally. Every day became another battle to remain standing long enough for her unborn child to survive. Nothing more. Suddenly, footsteps approached behind them. Jide entered wearing a dark gray shirt with rolled sleeves, speaking quietly into his phone. "Watch the port closely," he said coldly. "Nobody moves company assets without my knowledge." He ended the call immediately after noticing Oluwadarasimi watching him. For a brief moment, silence settled awkwardly across the room. Then Jide nodded once toward the food. "You should eat." The simplicity of his tone surprised her. No arrogance, no forced sympathy, just direct concern. Oluwadarasimi hesitated before speaking carefully. "The men who attacked me. Did they say anything else?" Jide sat across from her calmly. "They were hired through intermediaries, but connected to the Adebayo company." "Yes." Her chest tightened painfully. Even now, part of her still struggled to accept the possibility that Tunde's own family wanted her harmed. "Why?" she whispered. "What are they afraid of?" Jide studied her quietly. "Your husband left problems behind before he died." "What kind of problems?" "Financial records, illegal transfers, corruption." Oluwadarasimi frowned. Tunde hated corruption. "Exactly." The answer chilled her. Jide leaned back slightly. "Your husband was preparing to expose certain activities inside the company." Silence filled the room. Memories returned immediately. Tunde sitting quietly on the balcony weeks earlier, his worried face, his promise to protect her. Dear God, had he already known he was in danger? Oluwadarasimi suddenly lost her appetite completely. Meanwhile, inside the Adebayo corporate headquarters, panic had started replacing confidence. Femi slammed documents violently across the office table, while Kunle paced near the window, sweating heavily. "How did Kosoko become involved?" Femi snapped. "I don't know. You said the widow was isolated. She was..." Femi cursed angrily under his breath. Across Lagos, Jide Kosoko's name carried terrifying weight, because he rarely involved himself in family disputes unless something personal mattered. And now he was protecting Oluwadarasimi openly. That changed everything. "What if he discovers the transfer accounts?" Kunle whispered nervously. Femi turned sharply. "Then we make sure nobody talks." At that exact moment, several floors below them, Mr. Adewale quietly deleted financial records from his office computer with trembling hands. Guilt was eating him alive. Back in Ikoyi, Oluwadarasimi's condition worsened over the following week. The emotional stress finally began affecting her pregnancy dangerously. She suffered headaches constantly. Sharp pains came more frequently, and worst of all, she could no longer sleep without nightmares. One night she woke suddenly screaming Tunde's name. Security guards rushed outside her room immediately while Mama Bisola held her tightly as she cried uncontrollably. "He was calling me," Oluwadarasimi sobbed. "I heard him." Mama Bisola stroked her hair gently. Grief speaks with familiar voices, but the older woman herself looked worried afterward. The next afternoon, a doctor arrived privately at Jide's request. After the examination, the doctor's expression turned serious. "She needs complete rest," he warned. "Her blood pressure is becoming dangerous." Oluwadarasimi closed her eyes weakly. Another burden, another problem, another reminder that her body was slowly reaching its limit. That evening, while Mama Bisola prepared soup downstairs, Oluwadarasimi stood carefully beside the upstairs balcony, watching the sunset over Lagos. Orange light spread across distant buildings while traffic crawled endlessly through the city below. For several peaceful seconds, she simply breathed quietly. Then pain exploded suddenly through her stomach, sharp, violent. Oluwadarasimi gasped loudly and grabbed the railing. Another pain followed instantly. Stronger this time. No! Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. Sweat formed across her forehead immediately. Downstairs, one of the guards heard the noise first. Boss, everything changed within seconds. Mama Bisola rushed upstairs. Jide appeared almost immediately behind her. Oluwadarasimi could barely breathe now. The contractions were coming too fast, too early. The baby, she whispered in panic. Jide stepped forward instantly. Get the car. Minutes later, black SUVs raced dangerously through Lagos traffic toward a private hospital, while Oluwadarasimi cried in agony inside the back seat. Mama Bisola held her hand tightly. Stay strong, my daughter. But fear consumed everyone. The baby was not due yet. Inside the hospital emergency ward, nurses moved rapidly around her, while doctors shouted instructions across bright white hallways. Jide remained outside the delivery room, watching every movement with terrifying calmness. One nurse recognized him immediately and looked visibly nervous. Hours passed painfully. The hospital quieted gradually as midnight approached. Still, Jide did not leave. Not once. Finally, after another hour of unbearable labor, the sound arrived. A baby crying, small, weak, but alive. Oluwadarasimi burst into tears immediately upon hearing it. Pure relief shattered through her exhaustion. A nurse carefully placed the tiny newborn beside her briefly. A boy, she whispered softly. Oluwadarasimi stared at her child through blurred vision. Tunde's son, dear God. Tunde's son survived. She touched the baby's tiny hand gently before exhaustion finally overwhelmed her completely. Outside the room, Mama Bisola cried openly while thanking God repeatedly. Jide stood silently near the hallway window afterward, staring into the darkness beyond the hospital parking lot. For several minutes, nobody disturbed him. Then quietly, Mama Bisola approached. You care about them more than you admit. Jide remained expressionless. I repay debts. The older woman studied him carefully. No, she said softly. This is something else. For the first time all night, emotion flickered briefly across Jide's face. Not softness exactly. Pain, old pain. Eventually he spoke quietly without looking at her. Years ago I should have died. Mama Bisola listened silently. Men left me bleeding in the streets after a gang war. Nobody stopped to help. His jaw tightened slightly. Nobody except Tunde. He remembered it clearly. Young Tunde kneeling beside him despite the danger, dragging him into a car, protecting a stranger everyone else feared. He saved my life before I became powerful, Jide said quietly, back when I was still nothing. Mama Bisola looked toward the delivery room. And now you are protecting what remains of him. Jide said nothing afterward, but deep inside him something dangerous had already changed, because this was no longer only about debt. Now it was personal, and men like Jide Kosoko became most frightening when something turned personal. The baby's name was Ayomide. Joy has come. That was what the name meant. Mama Bisola chose it first while standing beside the hospital bed, holding the tiny child carefully in her arms. And for the first time in many weeks, Oluwadarasimi smiled without forcing herself. A small smile, fragile but real. Ayomide was tiny because he arrived too early, and the doctors warned that he would need careful attention during his first months. Sometimes his breathing became uneven. Sometimes he cried weakly through the night, until Oluwadarasimi panicked and called the nurses repeatedly. Fear became part of motherhood immediately, but so did purpose, because now, no matter how broken she felt, she had someone depending entirely on her survival. Every morning inside Jide's guarded Ikoyi residence began quietly now. Mama Bisola prepared warm pap inside the kitchen, while Oluwadarasimi sat beside the window, feeding Ayomide carefully beneath soft sunlight. Outside, armed guards still patrolled the compound. Inside, the child's breathing slowly transformed the atmosphere of the house. Even the workers smiled more often, but the outside world remained cruel. Rumors spread quickly across Lagos society after people discovered Oluwadarasimi was living under Jide Kosoko's protection. And Lagos loved gossip more than truth. She became the mistress of a mafia boss. She planned Tunde's death with Jide. She only married into the Adebayo family for money. Every lie cut deeply. One afternoon, Oluwadarasimi accidentally overheard two nurses whispering about her during a hospital checkup. That's her, the widow. Yes, the one living with Kosoko. She moved on quickly. The women lowered their voices immediately after noticing her nearby, but the damage was already done. Oluwadarasimi returned home in silence that day. Inside the bedroom, she sat beside Ayomide's crib, staring blankly at the wall while tears gathered slowly inside her eyes. She had lost her husband, lost her home, lost her reputation, and now even strangers spoke about her like she was something dirty. When Jide entered later that evening, he immediately sensed something was wrong. She avoided eye contact completely. What happened? Nothing. You're crying. Oluwadarasimi wiped her face quickly. I said, I'm fine. Jide remained standing quietly for several seconds. Then he walked toward the crib and looked down at Ayomide, sleeping peacefully beneath a thin blanket. The city talks too much, he said finally. Oluwadarasimi laughed bitterly. They think I'm sleeping with you. Jide's expression did not change. They fear what they don't understand. No, she whispered painfully. They enjoy destroying weak people. Silence settled between them afterward. Then unexpectedly Jide spoke again. Tunde used to say the same thing. Her chest tightened instantly, hearing his name. Jide looked toward her carefully. He hated how rich people treated ordinary people. Oluwadarasimi smiled sadly through tears. He always stopped for beggars. A faint, almost invisible smile touched Jide's face. Yes, even when it annoyed everyone around him. For several seconds both shared the same painful memory silently. Then Ayomide moved softly inside the crib and the moment disappeared again. Across Lagos, the situation inside the Adebayo Empire continued worsening rapidly. Femi and Kunle had spent years stealing money quietly through fake contracts, hidden accounts, and corrupt partnerships. Tunde had started uncovering everything before his death. Now those secrets were beginning to surface publicly. Government auditors requested financial reports. Journalists started asking questions. Several company workers disappeared suddenly after refusing to cooperate with illegal transfers. Fear spread through the corporation like disease. Inside his office, Femi smashed a whiskey glass against the wall violently. This is Kosoko, he growled. Kunle paced nervously nearby. What if someone talks? They won't. But neither brother truly believed that anymore, because guilt always weakens loyalty eventually. Meanwhile, Jide continued investigating quietly. One evening, he called Oluwadarasimi into his private office. She entered carefully, holding Ayomide against her chest. The room itself reflected Jide perfectly. Elegant, minimal, dangerously controlled. Documents covered the large desk, while several security monitors displayed live camera feeds from different locations across Lagos. Jide motioned toward a chair. I found something. Oluwadarasimi sat slowly. Jide slid a brown envelope across the desk. These belonged to Tunde. Her hands trembled instantly. Inside the envelope rested several legal papers, property documents, and handwritten notes. Oluwadarasimi recognized Tunde's handwriting immediately. Tears blurred her vision. He prepared these weeks before his death. Jide explained quietly. She read through the pages slowly, then her breathing stopped. Everything. Tunde had transferred nearly all his personal shares and assets to her and Iomide before he died. Properties, accounts, insurance funds, protected legally under confidential arrangements. He knew, she whispered shakily. Jide nodded once. He knew his brothers were planning something. Tears fell onto the documents. Oluwadarasimi suddenly remembered Tunde sitting awake late at night, reviewing files secretly inside their apartment, the worried expression on his face, his constant phone calls, his fear. Dear God. He had been preparing for disaster while trying to protect her silently. One handwritten note slipped from the envelope onto the desk. Oluwadarasimi picked it up slowly. The message was short. If anything happens to me, protect my wife and son from my family. Her entire body shook instantly. Jide watched her silently while she cried. Not loud crying, broken crying, the kind grief creates when love survives death. Tunde believed they would destroy us, she whispered. They already tried. She looked toward Jide carefully then. Why are you risking all this for us? For the first time since meeting him, Jide seemed unable to answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. Finally, he spoke quietly. Because I know what it means to lose everything. Something about his tone felt personal, deeply personal. Before Oluwadarasimi could ask further, one of Jide's security men entered suddenly. Boss! The urgency in his voice changed the room instantly. What is it? The guard looked toward Oluwadarasimi briefly before answering carefully. One of the Adebayo drivers wants to speak privately. Jide's eyes narrowed slightly. About what? He says Tunde's death was not an accident. Silence crashed across the office. Oluwadarasimi stopped breathing. The guard continued carefully. He claims someone ordered the brakes to be tampered with before the Abuja trip. Iomide stirred softly in her arms as fear flooded through her body again. No, not suspicion anymore, not possibility. Murder. Her husband had truly been murdered. And suddenly the room felt too small to contain the horror of that truth. Jide stood slowly from behind the desk. Cold fury entered his eyes immediately. Bring him somewhere safe, he ordered quietly. The guard nodded and left. Oluwadarasimi stared at Jide helplessly. What happens now? Jide looked toward her and for the first time since Tunde's death, she saw something more dangerous than power inside him. War. They made one mistake, he said softly. What? They thought you were alone. The driver's name was Sunday Okiki. He arrived at Jide's private warehouse near Apapa, trembling so badly that one of the guards had to help him sit down. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cool night air flowing through the building. Fear had already destroyed him before he spoke a single word. Jide sat across from him calmly while two armed men guarded the entrance. You asked for protection, Jide said quietly. Now talk. Sunday swallowed hard. For several seconds he stared at the table without lifting his eyes. Then finally the truth began spilling out. 3 days before Tunde's trip to Abuja, Sunday overheard an argument inside the underground parking garage at the Adebayo headquarters. Femi and Kunle were fighting with one of the company mechanics. At first, Sunday ignored it. Rich men argued constantly, but then he heard something that froze him. The brakes only need to fail after the expressway. Kunle had whispered angrily. Sunday's hands shook violently while speaking. I thought maybe I misunderstood, he said weakly. But after the accident, after Oga Tunde died, his voice cracked. I became afraid. Oluwadarasimi sat silently beside Jide, listening with tears filling her eyes. Every word felt like another knife entering her chest, because somewhere deep inside herself she had still hoped Tunde's death was an accident. Now even that final comfort was gone. Murder, she whispered painfully. Jide's expression remained cold. Did anyone else hear them? Sunday nodded slowly. The mechanic. Where is he now? The driver lowered his head. Missing. Silence settled heavily across the warehouse. Everyone understood what that likely meant. Dead. Jide leaned back slightly. Why come forward now? Sunday looked toward Oluwadarasimi, holding baby Ayomide quietly against her chest. Because Ogatunde was a good man, he whispered, and because they will kill more people if nobody stops them. For the first time that night, emotion flickered briefly inside Jide's eyes. Respect. Meanwhile, inside the Adebayo mansion, fear was beginning to poison the family from within. Madame Ronke barely slept anymore. Since throwing Oluwadarasimi out, strange tension had settled inside the house. Femi and Kunle argued constantly behind closed doors. Workers whispered nervously in corners. Business calls arrived late at night, followed by shouting. Even the mansion itself no longer felt peaceful. One evening, Madame Ronke entered Tunde's old bedroom alone for the first time since his funeral. Dust covered parts of the furniture now. The room smelled faintly of forgotten cologne and silence. Her eyes landed slowly on a framed photograph near the bedside table. Tunde smiling beside Oluwadarasimi during happier days. For several seconds, guilt touched her heart unexpectedly. Then she remembered the rumors again, the accusations, the manipulation, and anger returned quickly enough to bury guilt once more, but not completely. Elsewhere in Lagos, Oluwadarasimi struggled emotionally with the growing darkness surrounding Tunde's death. Every new truth revealed another layer of horror. The man she loved had not simply died. He had been betrayed by blood, by family, by greed. Late one night, after Ayomide finally fell asleep, Oluwadarasimi found Jide alone beside the balcony overlooking the city lights. "You already knew," she said quietly. Jide did not deny it. "I suspected, and now I know your husband was murdered." The directness of his answer hurt deeply. Oluwadarasimi wrapped her arms around herself. "What happens if you expose them?" "War?" She looked toward him sharply. "You say that too easily." Jide turned slowly toward her. "For men like Femi and Kunle, power matters more than blood. Men like that don't surrender peacefully." She lowered her eyes. "I don't want revenge. That may no longer matter." His words frightened her, because deep inside Oluwadarasimi could already feel the situation becoming larger than justice. Violence was approaching, and Jide seemed prepared for it. The following week, Jide intensified his investigation aggressively. Financial records disappeared from government offices overnight. Several corrupt company managers suddenly fled Lagos. 2 former employees secretly contacted Jide claiming Tunde had prepared evidence before his death. And everywhere pressure increased, fear followed. One afternoon, Jide's security chief entered his office urgently. "Boss, we have movement." "What kind?" "One of Femi's men has been watching the child." Jide's expression darkened instantly. What the guard placed surveillance photographs across the desk. Pictures of a black sedan parked outside the pediatric clinic. Pictures of unfamiliar men observing Oluwadarasimi carrying Ayomide. Pictures taken near Jide's residence. The room became dangerously silent. Jide stared at the photographs for several seconds before speaking. "Double security immediately." "Yes, boss." "And nobody touches the baby without clearance." The guard nodded quickly and left, but the warning arrived too late. 3 days later, Oluwadarasimi visited a small private clinic for Ayomide's breathing checkup. Mama Bisola accompanied her while 2 security men waited outside discreetly. The appointment itself seemed normal, until the lights suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the hallway instantly. Nurses gasped nearby. Backup generators failed strangely. Then screaming erupted outside. One of the guards shouted, "Protect, madam!" Panic exploded immediately. Oluwadarasimi clutched Ayomide tightly against her chest, while Mama Bisola grabbed her arm. "Stay behind me." Footsteps thundered through the corridor. A nurse ran past crying. Then suddenly 2 masked men appeared at the far end of the hallway. One carried a gun. Oluwadarasimi froze in horror. "No!" The men moved quickly toward her. "Take the child." Everything became chaos. One security guard tackled the armed attacker violently against the wall while patients screamed and ran in every direction. Glass shattered nearby. Another masked man lunged directly toward Oluwadarasimi. Mama Bisola struck him with a metal tray desperately. Rune Oluwadarasimi turned instinctively and fled down the emergency stairwell, holding Ayomide tightly while terror consumed her completely. Her legs shook violently descending the stairs. Ayomide began crying loudly from fear. Behind her, footsteps followed. Fast, closing distance. Oluwadarasimi reached the parking level, gasping for breath. Then suddenly strong hands grabbed her shoulder. She screamed instantly, but the familiar voice stopped her panic. "It's me, Jide." Relief nearly collapsed her body immediately. Behind him stood several armed men already surrounding the parking garage. One masked attacker tried escaping through the exit. He barely reached the gate before Jide's men intercepted him violently. The entire confrontation ended within seconds. Too fast, too organized, too terrifying. Oluwadarasimi held Ayomide against her chest, crying uncontrollably now while Jide examined the child quickly. "Is he hurt?" She shook her head weakly. "No, no." But her entire body trembled violently, because the truth had finally become undeniable. They were no longer trying to scare her, they wanted her son. Jide looked toward the captured attacker kneeling beside one of the vehicles. "Who sent you?" The man remained silent. One of Jide's guards hit him hard across the face immediately. Still silence. Then Jide stepped closer slowly. "You entered a hospital carrying weapons," he said quietly. "Do you understand what happens next?" For the first time, fear appeared in the attacker's eyes. Real fear. Because everyone in Lagos knew stories about men who crossed Jide Kosoko. The attacker's voice finally shook. "We only needed the baby." Oluwadarasimi felt the world stop, not her, Ayomide. Dear God, the realization nearly destroyed her completely. Jide's eyes turned ice cold. Why? The attacker hesitated only briefly, to force the widow to sign the inheritance papers. Silence exploded across the parking garage. Oluwadarasimi stared downward at her crying son while horror consumed every part of her soul. Her husband had been murdered. Now his family wanted to use her child as leverage. And suddenly grief transformed into something new inside her, not revenge, not hatred, protection. Because no mother survives this kind of fear unchanged. After the hospital attack, fear no longer lived quietly inside Oluwadarasimi. It controlled everything. Every sound near Ayomide's crib made her panic awake at night. Every unfamiliar vehicle outside the compound forced her heart into terror. Even when security guards changed shifts near the gate, she rushed toward the window instinctively to check if her son was safe. Motherhood had transformed into survival, and somewhere deep inside herself, Oluwadarasimi hated what grief was turning her into. 3 nights after the attack, she stood beside Ayomide's crib, watching him sleep beneath dim yellow light. His tiny chest rose and fell softly, while one small hand remained curled beside his face. So innocent, so defenseless. Tears filled her eyes immediately. "Tunda," she whispered painfully, "how do I protect him alone?" Behind her, the bedroom door opened quietly. Jide entered carrying a small folder in one hand. "You should rest." Oluwadarasimi laughed weakly without humor. How Jide remained silent, because there was no honest answer. He placed the folder carefully on the nearby table. The men from the hospital talked. Her body stiffened instantly. What did they say? They were hired through a shell company connected to Kunle. Oluwadarasimi closed her eyes slowly. Another betrayal, another confirmation. Every day revealed a new level of cruelty inside the Adebayo family. Jide watched her carefully. "You cannot leave this house now. I know, the child remains the target." That sentence shattered something inside her again. Not the inheritance, not the company. Ayomide himself, a baby being hunted because of greed. Oluwadarasimi suddenly turned toward Jide with visible anger. "When does this end?" The question hung heavily between them. Jide's face remained unreadable. "It ends when they stop breathing," he answered quietly. The coldness in his voice frightened her instantly. "No." His eyes narrowed slightly. "No, I want justice," she whispered shakily. "Not murder." Jide looked toward the sleeping child before answering. "Men like Femi and Kunle do not fear courts. That doesn't mean you become like them." Silence settled across the room, dangerous silence, because both understood something important now. Their paths toward justice were not the same. Jide had survived Lagos through violence, power, and fear. He trusted consequences people could touch physically. But Oluwadarasimi still believed truth mattered more than blood, even after everything. The following morning, Lagos woke to shocking news. 3 luxury trucks connected to illegal Adebayo company operations had been intercepted overnight near the port. Authorities discovered smuggled weapons hidden beneath imported construction equipment. Panic exploded instantly inside the corporation. News channels covered the scandal non-stop. Politicians started distancing themselves publicly. And inside the Adebayo mansion, chaos erupted. Femi stormed through the living room, smashing objects violently, while Kunle argued with lawyers over the phone. "This is Kosoko," Femi shouted. "He's dismantling us piece by piece." Madame Ronke sat silently nearby, looking pale and exhausted. For weeks, she had watched her sons grow more paranoid, more aggressive, more afraid, and slowly, doubt had entered her heart. Especially after the hospital incident became public secretly through whispers. Kidnapping a baby, dear God. What had her sons truly become? Meanwhile, Jide's retaliation against the attack continued quietly across Lagos. Warehouses connected to the kidnappers suddenly closed. Several criminal middlemen disappeared overnight. Financial routes supporting the Adebayo brothers collapsed one after another mysteriously. Nobody could prove Jide's involvement, but everyone understood the message. Touch Oluwadarasimi, or the child again, and destruction would follow. Inside the Ikoyi residence, however, Oluwadarasimi became increasingly disturbed by the darkness surrounding Jide's methods. One evening, she accidentally overheard 2 guards speaking outside the hallway. "They found one of the kidnappers this morning. What happened? Nobody knows. But he'll never work again." The men laughed quietly afterward. Oluwadarasimi felt cold immediately. Later that night, she confronted Jide directly. "What did you do to them?" Jide sat calmly inside his office, reviewing documents. "They made choices. That's not an answer." He finally looked toward her. "What exactly do you want from me, Oluwadarasimi?" "I want this to stop becoming violent." His expression hardened slightly. "Violence started when they murdered your husband." The truth silenced her briefly. Still, she forced herself to continue. "And if you kill them too, what happens after that?" Jide stood slowly from behind the desk. For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then quietly, he spoke. "You think men like me enjoy violence?" She said nothing, because honestly, she did not know anymore. Jide walked toward the large window overlooking the city lights outside. "When I was 15, he began quietly. My father owed money to local criminals in Ajagunle. Oluwadarasimi remained silent, listening. One night they came for payment. His voice carried no emotion now. Too controlled, too practiced. They beat my father in front of us. My mother begged them to stop." He paused briefly. "But fear excites cruel men." Oluwadarasimi felt her chest tighten. Jide continued staring outside. "My younger brother tried protecting our mother." His jaw tightened slightly. "They killed him first." The room became painfully silent. Oluwadarasimi suddenly understood something terrifying. Jide's coldness had not been born naturally. Pain created it. After that night, he said quietly, "I learned something important about this city." He turned slowly toward her. Mercy without power gets people buried. The sentence stayed suspended heavily between them. Oluwadarasimi could see it now, the scars beneath the expensive suits, the trauma hidden beneath control. Jide Kosoko was not simply dangerous, he was a man who survived becoming emotionally numb because softness once destroyed his family. For the first time since meeting him, she no longer saw only fear. She saw loneliness too. Meanwhile, across Lagos, another dangerous crack formed inside the Adebayo Empire. Kunle had started drinking heavily. Guilt poisoned him slowly every day after Tunde's death. At first, greed felt worth it. The money, the control, the inheritance. But now their empire was collapsing anyway, and Jide Kosoko was hunting them patiently. Late one night, Kunle sat drunk inside his office, staring at old photographs of himself and Tunde as children. In one picture, Tunde carried him on his back, laughing. The memory nearly destroyed him emotionally. Suddenly, his office phone rang. Kunle answered shakily. What? The voice on the other end spoke urgently. One of the mechanics survived. Kunle froze instantly. What? He disappeared before the cleanup. Fear flooded his body immediately. Because if the mechanic talked, everything ended. Back inside the Ikoyi residence, Oluwadarasimi finally fell asleep near dawn after another exhausting night caring for Ayomide. But peace never lasted long anymore. A loud argument downstairs woke her suddenly. Voices shouting, male anger. She hurried carefully toward the hallway, holding Ayomide against her chest. Downstairs, Jide stood facing one of his own men aggressively. "You disobeyed my order," Jide said coldly. The man looked terrified. He talked too much, boss. And now he's dead. Oluwadarasimi stopped breathing. Dead. The kidnapper. Dear God. Jide noticed her standing there instantly. For several seconds, silence consumed the room. Then Oluwadarasimi whispered the question already breaking her heart. "Is this who you really are?" Jide looked at her quietly, and for the first time since entering her life, he had no defense left. The silence after Oluwadarasimi's question felt heavier than shouting. "Is this who you really are?" Jide stood motionless in the middle of the living room while his frightened bodyguard lowered his eyes toward the floor. Early morning sunlight stretched through the tall windows, illuminating the tension covering every corner of the house. Ayomide stirred softly against Oluwadarasimi's chest. Still alive, still innocent, still trapped inside a war created by adults. Jide finally dismissed the guard with a cold glance. "Leave." The man disappeared immediately. Then only silence remained between them. Oluwadarasimi looked at Jide carefully now, not as the protector who rescued her from the streets, but as the man Lagos whispered about in fear. A man capable of violence, a man capable of death. "You promised to protect us," she whispered shakily. "Not become a monster for us." Jide's jaw tightened slightly. "You think monsters are born naturally. That doesn't justify killing people." His eyes darkened immediately. "That man tried kidnapping your child, and now another mother will bury her son." The sentence struck harder than anger. For several seconds, Jide could not answer, because despite everything violence had taught him, Oluwadarasimi still spoke from a place his soul barely remembered anymore. Humanity. Finally, he spoke quietly. "You still believe mercy changes men like that?" "No," she answered painfully. "But hatred changes us." Those words stayed with Jide long after she walked away upstairs carrying Ayomide. For the first time in years, guilt entered him like poison. Not guilt for violence itself. He had crossed that emotional line long ago. But guilt because Oluwadarasimi had looked at him with disappointment instead of fear. And somehow, that hurt more. Later that afternoon, without informing anyone, Oluwadarasimi made a dangerous decision. She wanted answers, not from lawyers, not from investigators, from Madame Ronke herself. Mama Bisola nearly panicked when Oluwadarasimi announced her plan. "You cannot go there alone. I won't be alone. Those people tried taking your child." Oluwadarasimi kissed Ayomide gently before placing him carefully into Mama Bisola's arms. "I need to know whether his grandmother still has a conscience." Within the hour, one of Jide's trusted drivers secretly escorted her towards the Adebayo mansion. The journey through Lagos felt strangely familiar and painful at the same time. Markets overflowed with people. Yellow buses fought aggressively through traffic. Street vendors knocked on car windows selling bottled water and newspapers. Life continued, even while families destroyed themselves. When the black SUV finally stopped outside the mansion gates, Oluwadarasimi's chest tightened painfully. Memories flooded her instantly. Arriving here as a new bride beside Tunde, family dinners, birthday celebrations, moments that once felt permanent. Now the mansion looked colder somehow, like grief itself had poisoned the walls. The guards recognized her immediately and exchanged nervous glances. One hurried inside without speaking. Minutes later, the gates opened slowly. Oluwadarasimi stepped out carefully, wearing a simple cream-colored dress, while warm wind moved softly through the compound. The silence inside the mansion felt unnatural. No music, no laughter, no peace. Madame Ronke waited inside the large sitting room, dressed in dark, traditional clothing. Age and stress had changed her visibly within recent weeks. Her face looked thinner, her eyes carried exhaustion, but pride still remained. "You came back," the older woman said coldly. "I came for truth." Madame Ronke laughed bitterly. "Truth?" She folded her arms. "After everything you caused," Oluwadarasimi stared at her quietly. "I loved your son. You controlled him." "No," Oluwadarasimi whispered painfully. "I protected him from people who used him." The old woman's eyes flashed angrily. "You think my sons are criminals? I think your sons are afraid." Silence crashed across the room. Madame Ronke stepped closer slowly. "Since you entered this family, death has followed us." Oluwadarasimi shook her head. "No, Mama. Greed followed this family long before me." The sentence landed heavily. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Oluwadarasimi removed several folded papers from her handbag and placed them carefully on the table. "Tunde's legal documents." Madame Ronke frowned immediately. "What is this read?" The older woman picked up the papers reluctantly. As her eyes moved across the pages, confusion slowly entered her face. Then shock. "These shares," she whispered. "Tunde transferred them legally before he died." "No." He knew someone inside this family was betraying him. Madame Ronke's hands trembled slightly now. Oluwadarasimi watched carefully. For the first time, uncertainty cracked the older woman's anger. "Tunde loved this family," Oluwadarasimi said quietly. "Why would he secretly prepare protection documents unless he was afraid?" Madame Ronke remained silent, because deep inside herself, she already knew the answer. Over recent months, she had watched Femi and Kunle become increasingly desperate for control. Money disappeared strangely from company accounts. Tunde argued constantly with his brothers behind closed doors, and after his death, too many things happened too quickly, too smoothly. Suddenly another memory returned sharply to her mind. The night before Tunde's funeral, she overheard Femi burning documents inside his office. At the time, she ignored it because grief consumed her. Now fear entered her heart instead. "No," she whispered weakly. Oluwadarasimi's eyes filled with tears. "Mama, they tried kidnapping Ayomide." The older woman looked up sharply. "What? They wanted inheritance papers." For the first time since Tunde's death, genuine horror appeared on Madame Ronke's face. No, they sent armed men after a baby. Silence swallowed the room completely. The old woman slowly sat down as if her legs suddenly weakened beneath her. Everything she believed began collapsing at once. Had she truly helped destroy her own son's family? Had grief blinded her so deeply, tears gathered slowly inside her eyes? But before she could speak again, voices erupted somewhere deeper inside the mansion. Males shouting, "Femi!" Then another crash followed. Madame Ronke looked alarmed instantly. Oluwadarasimi stood carefully. What's happening? Neither woman received an answer because seconds later one frightened housemaid rushed into the room. "Madam, what is it?" The maid looked terrified. "Police officers are downstairs asking questions about company accounts." Fear exploded across Madame Ronke's face immediately. Then more shouting followed upstairs. Kunle appeared suddenly near the staircase looking drunk and unstable. His eyes widened the moment he saw Oluwadarasimi. "You!" His voice carried hatred instantly. "You brought this," Madame Ronke stood sharply. "What is happening, Kunle?" "Nothing. Why are police here?" Kunle's breathing became uneven. Then unexpectedly Madame Ronke slapped him across the face. Hard. The entire room froze. "Tell me the truth," she whispered shakily. Kunle stared at her in shock. "Mother, did you kill your brother?" The question shattered the room completely. Even Oluwadarasimi stopped breathing. Kunle's silence lasted only seconds. But it was enough, because sometimes silence confesses more honestly than words. Madame Ronke staggered backward slowly as tears filled her eyes. "No," she whispered brokenly. "No." And in that moment, Oluwadarasimi watched a mother realize the greatest tragedy of her life. Her son had not died in an accident. He had been betrayed by his own blood. The collapse of the Adebayo Empire began publicly 3 days later. By sunrise, every major news station in Lagos carried the same headline: Adebayo Group under criminal investigation. Images of police officers entering company offices flooded television screens, while journalists crowded outside the corporate headquarters demanding answers. Government officials suddenly denied previous relationships with the company. Investors panicked. Employees whispered fearfully inside elevators and hallways. Years of corruption were finally surfacing, and somewhere beneath all the scandal, Tunde's ghost seemed to stand quietly watching justice begin. Inside the Adebayo mansion, nobody spoke during breakfast anymore. The once proud family now lived inside silence and suspicion. Madame Ronke barely touched her food while staring blankly through the dining room window. Since confronting Kunle days earlier, sleep had abandoned her completely. Every memory of Tunde now returned poisoned with guilt. His smile, his kindness, his warnings she ignored. Worst of all, the memory of throwing Oluwadarasimi out while carrying Tunde's child. The shame slowly crushed her spirit. Across the table, Femi read newspapers aggressively while pretending control still existed. "This is temporary," he muttered coldly. Kunle laughed bitterly. "Temporary." His eyes looked bloodshot from alcohol and exhaustion. "The government froze 3 accounts yesterday. Then stop panicking. You should panic too." Femi slammed the newspaper onto the table. "Control yourself." Madame Ronke suddenly stood. "No," she whispered weakly. "You tell me the truth first." Silence spread instantly. The older woman stared directly at both sons. "Did you kill Tunde?" Neither man answered. That silence itself felt like confession now. Madame Ronke covered her mouth painfully as tears filled her eyes again. "My God." She turned and walked away before either son could stop her. Meanwhile, inside the Ikoyi residence, Oluwadarasimi watched the television quietly while Ayomide slept against her shoulder. News anchors discussed corruption, smuggling, hidden accounts, and illegal transactions tied to the Adebayo Empire. Photographs of Femi and Kunle flashed repeatedly across the screen. Mama Bisola switched off the television eventually. You should rest your mind. Oluwadarasimi lowered her eyes. I used to pray this family would accept me someday. The older woman sat beside her gently. Some people only recognize love after destroying it. Oluwadarasimi kissed Ayomide softly. Part of her expected satisfaction seeing the family collapse publicly. But strangely, she mostly felt tired. Tired of grief, tired of fear, tired of hatred consuming everyone around her. That afternoon, Jide returned home carrying another file. His expression immediately told her something important had changed. We found more evidence, he said quietly. Oluwadarasimi looked toward him carefully. What kind? Jide placed a small flash drive onto the table. Tunde recorded conversations before he died. Her heartbeat stopped. What? He suspected his brothers already. For several seconds she could not even move. Tunde, alone, afraid, secretly collecting evidence while pretending everything remained normal. The thought shattered her emotionally. Can we listen to it? Jide hesitated briefly, then nodded once. Minutes later, they sat together inside the private office while one of Jide's technicians connected the device to a laptop. Static filled the speakers first, then voices emerged. Femi, Kunle, arguing, money, accounts, threats. Oluwadarasimi's hands trembled violently as she listened. Then suddenly Tunde's voice appeared. Calm, tired, heartbreakingly familiar. If father were alive, he would be ashamed of both of you. Oluwadarasimi burst into tears immediately. Hearing him again after death felt unbearable. The recording continued. You're destroying this family for money, Tunde said. Femi laughed coldly through the speakers. You were always weak, and you were always greedy. Then came the sentence that froze everyone inside the room. If anything happens to me, Tunde warned quietly, protect my wife and child from them. The recording ended abruptly afterward. Silence swallowed the office completely. Oluwadarasimi cried openly now, with Ayomide resting against her chest. Jide remained standing near the desk, his face unreadable. But inside him, fury deepened dangerously, because now there was no doubt left. Tunde knew they wanted him gone. Later that evening, one of Jide's trusted investigators arrived with additional information. The mechanic has been found. Jide looked up immediately. Alive. Yes. Oluwadarasimi's chest tightened instantly. We're hiding near Ibadan. The investigator handed over photographs carefully. The man is terrified. He says Kunle paid him to tamper with the brakes. Oluwadarasimi closed her eyes painfully. Every new truth made breathing harder. Jide read through the statements silently. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. There's more. What? The investigator hesitated. The mechanic claims someone else ordered everything. Silence entered the room immediately. Who? Jide asked quietly. We don't know yet, but the answer already changed everything. Because until now, everyone believed Femi and Kunle were the masterminds. What if they were only part of something larger? That same night, panic exploded again inside the Adebayo mansion. Kunle arrived drunk after midnight, carrying a pistol recklessly while shouting at servants. We're finished, he screamed. Femi grabbed him aggressively. Lower your voice. Why, Kunle laughed hysterically. Kosoko already knows Madame Ronke appeared near the staircase wearing a white nightrobe. What have you done to this family? Kunle stared toward her with tears suddenly filling his eyes. Unexpected tears. Real ones. You think I wanted this? He whispered brokenly. The room fell silent. Femi immediately looked alarmed. Stop talking. But Kunle no longer cared. Years of guilt, fear, and alcohol finally broke something inside him. He threatened us, Kunle whispered. Madame Ronke frowned. Kunle's breathing became uneven. He said Tunde would expose everyone. Who? Before he could answer, Femi suddenly struck him hard across the face. Enough, Madame Ronke gasped in shock. Femi looked terrified now, not angry, terrified, and for the first time the older woman realized something horrifying. Her sons were afraid of someone else too. Meanwhile, back in Ikoyi, Oluwadarasimi sat awake alone near Ayomide's crib long after midnight. The recording of Tunde's voice replayed repeatedly inside her mind. Protect my wife and child from them. Even while facing betrayal and danger, Tunde's final concern remained his family. That realization both comforted and destroyed her emotionally. Soft footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Jide entered quietly, holding a phone in one hand. We have a problem. Fear immediately returned to her face. What happened? Jide looked unusually tense now. The mechanic disappeared again. He vanished before my men reached the safe house. Oluwadarasimi's stomach tightened painfully. No. Jide stared toward the dark window thoughtfully. This means whoever controls the Adebayo operation still has eyes everywhere, and if the mechanic talks first, he dies. The brutal honesty of his answer chilled the room. Ayomide suddenly began crying softly inside the crib. Oluwadarasimi picked him up immediately and held him close. Then quietly, almost to herself, she whispered the question now haunting her constantly. How many more people have to suffer because of greed? Neither she nor Jide had an answer anymore. The mechanic's body was discovered 2 days later beside an abandoned road outside Ibadan. By the time police arrived, fear had already done its work. The man's phone was missing, his documents were gone, and whatever secrets he still carried had nearly died with him. Nearly. Because before disappearing, the mechanic had sent one final message through a hidden number connected to Jide's network. One audio file, 37 seconds long. That file changed everything. Inside the Ikoyi residence, tension filled the air as Jide's most trusted investigator connected a laptop to the television screen. Mama Bisola sat quietly near the corner, holding Ayomide, while Oluwadarasimi remained motionless beside the couch. Nobody spoke. Even the guards outside the room looked nervous. The investigator pressed play. Static crackled briefly through the speakers. Then the mechanic's frightened voice emerged. If anything happens to me, it was not only the brothers. Oluwadarasimi's heartbeat slowed painfully. The man continued breathing heavily between words. They were following orders from someone higher, someone connected to the old company accounts. Jide narrowed his eyes slightly. Then came the sentence that froze the room completely. It was Chief Balogun. Silence exploded instantly. Oluwadarasimi frowned in confusion. Chief Balogun. But Jide's expression changed immediately, dangerously, because he knew exactly who that name belonged to. Chief Bode Balogun, one of Nigeria's most powerful businessmen, a political kingmaker, a long-time silent investor inside the Adebayo empire, and worse, the man who mentored Femi and Kunle after their father died. The mechanic's recording continued shakily. Tunde discovered illegal contracts, money laundering, weapon shipments. He coughed painfully. Chief Balogun said Tunde became a threat. The recording ended abruptly afterward. No goodbye, no final words, only silence. Oluwadarasimi slowly sat down again because her legs suddenly felt weak beneath her. This whole time, she whispered. Jide remained staring at the dark screen. Yes, it wasn't just greed. No, it was larger, darker, more dangerous than family betrayal alone. Tunde had uncovered corruption involving powerful men far beyond the Adebayo family, and that truth likely cost him his life. Mama Bisola crossed herself quietly. Dear God. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Chief Bode Balogun sat calmly inside his luxury office overlooking Victoria Island while journalists attacked the Adebayo company publicly on television. Unlike Femi and Kunle, Chief Balogun showed no panic, only irritation. He was older than them, smarter, more experienced in surviving scandals. His expensive gray suit looked perfect beneath the office lights while 2 security men stood silently near the door. Then his private phone rang. he answered without greeting. Kosoko knows the voice warned. Chief Balogan's expression hardened slightly, and the mechanic dead. A long silence followed. Finally, Chief Balogan spoke quietly, then removed the remaining problems too. Back in Ikoyi, Oluwadarasimi could barely process the truth emotionally. She walked slowly into Ayomide's nursery afterward and stood beside the crib staring at her son. So much suffering, so much death. All because powerful men feared losing money. Tears rolled silently down her face. "Tunde died trying to protect us," she whispered painfully. Behind her, Jide entered quietly. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Oluwadarasimi turned toward him. "You knew this man," Jide nodded once. "Everyone in Lagos knows Chief Balogan. Why hasn't he been arrested?" A bitter smile crossed Jide's face briefly. "Because men like him build the systems, deciding who gets arrested." The answer frightened her deeply, because it sounded hopeless. Jide stepped closer toward the crib slowly. "Your husband underestimated how dangerous this became." "No," Oluwadarasimi whispered. "He trusted the wrong people." The sentence landed heavily between them. Jide looked down briefly before speaking again. "There's something else you need to know." Fear immediately returned to her chest. What Jide hesitated, rare for him. Then finally he answered. "Tunde contacted me before he died." Oluwadarasimi stared at him in shock. "What?" "He came to me privately 3 weeks before the Abuja trip." Her breathing became uneven. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I failed him." Silence filled the nursery. Jide rarely spoke about failure. Men like him survived by controlling outcomes. But now, genuine regret appeared inside his voice. "He brought evidence against Balogan," Jide continued quietly. "He wanted protection for you and the baby. If things became dangerous." Oluwadarasimi covered her mouth painfully. Tunde knew he might die. He hoped it wouldn't reach that point, but it did. Jide lowered his eyes briefly. "Yes." For the first time since meeting him, Oluwadarasimi saw guilt inside Jide clearly. Real guilt. "I should have moved faster," he admitted quietly. "I underestimated how desperate Balogan would become." The confession changed something emotionally between them, because suddenly Jide no longer looked untouchable. He looked human, a dangerous man carrying his own regrets. Meanwhile, the Adebayo family itself finally began collapsing internally. Kunle could no longer handle the pressure. Alcohol stopped numbing him, sleep disappeared completely, and guilt consumed him every waking moment. Late one evening, he entered Madame Ronca's bedroom unexpectedly while trembling violently. His mother looked up from prayer immediately. "What is wrong with you?" Kunle fell to his knees. The movement shocked her instantly. "Mama," his voice cracked. "I didn't want Tunde to die." Fear spread across her face. "What did you do?" Tears poured openly down his cheeks now. "Balogun threatened us. He said if Tunde exposed the contracts, we would all lose everything." Madame Ronque stared at her son in horror. "No, we only wanted to scare him at first." The old woman backed away slowly. "What do you mean, scare him?" Kunle buried his face in his shaking hands. "The brakes. We thought the accident would only injure him." The confession shattered her completely. Madame Ronque slapped him repeatedly through tears. "Murderer!" she screamed brokenly. "You killed your brother!" Kunle cried openly now. Real grief, real regret. Too late, always too late. Elsewhere, Chief Balogan was already preparing his escape quietly. Private accounts transferred money overseas overnight. Secret documents disappeared from offices. Several loyal men left Lagos suddenly without explanation. And one final order was given: eliminate Kosoko. Back inside the Ikoyi residence, Jide's security chief rushed into the office shortly after midnight. "Boss," Jide immediately sensed danger. "What happened?" "We intercepted communication linked to Balogan," and the guard swallowed hard. "They're preparing a hit." Oluwadarasimi froze immediately. "On who?" The answer came quietly. You. Silence swallowed the room. Ayomide suddenly began crying from the nursery nearby as tension spread everywhere. Jide remained unnaturally calm, but everyone around him understood the truth now. This war had escalated beyond hidden attacks and legal investigations. Chief Balogun wanted bodies, real ones. Oluwadarasimi looked toward Jide with visible fear. What do we do? Jide stood slowly from his chair. For several seconds he stared out toward the dark Lagos skyline beyond the windows. Then finally he answered with terrifying certainty. We finish this before Balogun reaches your son. And somewhere deep inside herself, Oluwadarasimi realized something frightening. The final confrontation was coming, and not everyone would survive it. The night before the final confrontation, Lagos felt unusually tense. Rain clouds gathered above the city, while police sirens echoed through distant streets. Television stations continued broadcasting updates about the collapsing Adebayo empire. Politicians denied involvement. Investors fled quietly. Former employees disappeared overnight. And somewhere beneath all the chaos, Chief Bode Balogun was preparing to run. Inside the Ikoyi residence, armed guards doubled security, while Jide's men monitored roads, ports, airports, and private docks across Lagos. Nobody slept. Not really. Oluwadarasimi sat beside Ayomide's crib, watching her son breathe softly, while Mama Bisola prayed quietly nearby. Fear had exhausted her completely. For months, she survived betrayal, grief, humiliation, and violence by focusing only on survival. But now the end finally approached, and endings frightened her more than suffering sometimes, because endings demanded loss. Suddenly footsteps approached outside the nursery. Jide entered wearing black clothing beneath a dark coat, his expression sharper than usual. Immediately Oluwadarasimi understood. You found him. Jide nodded once. Balogun is moving money through the Lagos docks tonight. Mama Bisola looked alarmed. That means he's escaping. Yes. Oluwadarasimi stood slowly from beside the crib. Then let the police arrest him. Jide's silence answered first. Then quietly he said, some police officers still belong to him. Fear tightened inside her chest instantly. You're going there yourself. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Her voice cracked louder than intended. Ayomide stirred softly inside the crib. Oluwadarasimi lowered her voice immediately, but tears already filled her eyes. I'm tired of death, Jide. The room became painfully silent. He looked toward the child briefly before answering, So am I. For one moment, the exhaustion inside his voice sounded older than his body itself. Oluwadarasimi stepped closer. If you go tonight, promise me you won't become what Balogun is. Jide looked at her quietly. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his coat and placed a small envelope into her hands. What is this? If something happens to me, no. Oluwadarasimi. No tears spilled instantly down her face. Stop talking like death already belongs to you. The raw fear in her voice stunned him briefly. For months he had protected her because of Tunde, but somewhere along the way protecting her stopped feeling like duty, and that realization became dangerous emotionally. Jide slowly closed her fingers around the envelope. Keep Ayomide safe, he whispered. Then he turned and walked away before emotions could weaken him further. Hours later, black SUVs moved silently through Lagos toward the docks near Apapa. Rain began falling lightly now, covering the city in wet reflections and distant thunder. Cargo ships rested beside dark waters while armed guards patrolled enormous shipping containers under weak industrial lights. Somewhere among them, Chief Balogun prepared to disappear forever. Inside one warehouse, Balogun stood beside stacked crates filled with cash documents and hidden hard drives. Several loyal men loaded the final containers rapidly, while boats waited near the docks. Move faster, Balogun snapped. One bodyguard approached nervously. Sir? Kosoko's men have been spotted nearby. For the first time that night, real concern crossed Balogan's face. Then headlights appeared outside. Black SUVs, too many. Balogan cursed softly. He found us. Seconds later, gunfire exploded across the docks. Workers screamed and scattered immediately while armed men exchanged bullets between cargo containers. Metal echoed violently beneath the storm as chaos consumed the port. Jide moved through the darkness calmly beside his men, focused entirely on reaching Balogan. No fear, no hesitation, only purpose. Meanwhile, inside the Ikoyi residence, Oluwadarasimi paced anxiously, with Ayomide against her chest, while every minute felt unbearable. Mama Bisola tried calming her gently. He will survive. But Oluwadarasimi barely heard her, because deep inside herself, terrible instincts screamed danger. Then suddenly, one of the security alarms outside activated violently. The entire house froze. A guard shouted downstairs. "Protect Madam!" Panic exploded instantly. Oluwadarasimi clutched Ayomide tightly, while armed men rushed through the hallways. Another attack. Dear God! Mama Bisola grabbed her arm. The safe room. Before they could move, glass shattered downstairs. Gunshots followed immediately. The attack had already reached the compound. Outside, several armed men dressed in dark clothing stormed through the gates after neutralizing part of the security team. Chief Balogan's final order: kill everyone. Oluwadarasimi ran through the hallway carrying Ayomide, while terror consumed every heartbeat. Behind her, guards exchanged gunfire with attackers throughout the mansion. Walls cracked. Furniture shattered. Men screamed downstairs. Mama Bisola prayed loudly through tears while pulling Oluwadarasimi toward the hidden safe room behind Jide's office. Then suddenly, one attacker appeared at the far end of the hallway, gun raised. Everything slowed. Oluwadarasimi froze instinctively, protecting Ayomide against her chest. The man aimed directly toward them, but before he could fire, another gunshot exploded from behind. The attacker collapsed instantly. Jide. He appeared at the opposite end of the hallway, breathing heavily, blood visible along one sleeve. Oluwadarasimi nearly collapsed from relief. "You're hurt. Inside the safe room now." Another burst of gunfire erupted downstairs. The attackers were getting closer. Jide shoved open the hidden steel door, while security men rushed forward to block the hallway. Oluwadarasimi grabbed his arm desperately. "Come with us. I need to finish this." "No." Tears streamed down her face openly now. "You already protected us enough." For 1 second, emotions nearly broke through Jide's controlled mask completely. Then another explosion shook the lower floor violently. Time disappeared again. He touched Ayomide's head briefly, then looked directly at Oluwadarasimi. "You and this child are the only good thing left from Tunde's life." The sentence shattered her emotionally. Before she could answer, Jide closed the safe room door from outside. Heavy locks sealed instantly, and just like that she lost sight of him. Outside the room, war consumed the mansion completely. Jide moved through smoke-filled hallways alongside remaining guards, while bullets tore through walls and glass around them. Somewhere downstairs, one attacker screamed after being hit. Then suddenly, a familiar voice echoed through the chaos. Enough Chief Balogan himself stepped into the destroyed living room, surrounded by armed men, older, calm, still terrifyingly composed. Rainwater dripped from his expensive coat, while dead silence spread briefly between both sides. Balogan looked toward Jide coldly. All this destruction over one widow. Jide's eyes hardened instantly. "No, over a good man you murdered." Balogan smiled faintly. Tunde became emotional. "Weak men die early." Rage entered Jide like fire, but before violence resumed, police sirens exploded outside the compound unexpectedly. Real police, not Balogan's corrupt network. The old man's expression changed immediately, because suddenly, escape became impossible. And for the first time that night, fear finally entered Chief Bode Balogan's eyes. The moment police stormed the compound, everything changed. Sirens echoed through the rainy Lagos night while armed officers surrounded the mansion from every direction. Flashing blue and red lights reflected across shattered windows, broken marble floors, and terrified faces. Chief Bode Balogan slowly lowered his weapon. For the first time in decades, power could not protect him instantly. Several officers rushed forward, ordering everyone to the ground, while Jide remained standing silently near the center of the destroyed living room, blood dripping slowly from his injured arm. One officer recognized Balogan immediately. "Sir, please lower your hands." The old businessman smiled bitterly. "You people finally remembered justice exists." Nobody answered, because everyone present understood something uncomfortable. Men like Balogan survived for years precisely because powerful systems protected them, until suddenly they didn't. Meanwhile, inside the safe room upstairs, Oluwadarasimi sat trembling beside Mama Bisola, while Ayomide cried softly against her chest. Then finally the heavy steel door opened. Jide appeared, alive. Oluwadarasimi nearly collapsed from relief immediately. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," but blood soaked part of his sleeve heavily now. Without thinking, she rushed toward him while tears streamed openly down her face. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence itself carried too much emotion already. Then Mama Bisola quietly took Ayomide from Oluwadarasimi's arms and moved aside intentionally, because even old women recognized moments the heart needed privately. "You came back," Oluwadarasimi whispered shakily. Jide looked at her quietly. "I promised." The simplicity of the answer nearly destroyed her emotionally. Hours later, dawn slowly rose across Lagos while television stations exploded with breaking news. Chief Bode Balogan arrested, illegal weapons seized, massive corruption network exposed. The Adebayo Empire officially collapsed before sunrise. Across the city, people gathered around televisions, inside markets, restaurants, and bus stations, watching powerful men finally dragged into police vehicles. Some celebrated, others looked shocked. But for Oluwadarasimi, victory felt strangely painful, because none of it brought Tunde back. 3 days later, the official public investigation began. Courtrooms overflowed with journalists while former employees, accountants, and witnesses finally stepped forward openly. One by one, hidden crimes surfaced publicly. Money laundering, illegal contracts, bribery, smuggling, and finally, Tunde Adebayo's murder. Inside the courtroom, Oluwadarasimi sat quietly holding Ayomide, while cameras flashed endlessly around her. Across the room sat Femi and Kunle wearing prison uniforms beneath heavy security. They no longer looked powerful, only broken, especially Kunle. The younger brother could barely lift his eyes from the floor anymore. Years of greed had ended exactly where Tunde once warned they would, in shame. Then Madame Ronke entered slowly. The entire courtroom fell silent briefly. The old woman looked transformed by grief. Age seemed to have reached her suddenly all at once. Her once proud posture now carried exhaustion and regret instead. When her eyes met Oluwadarasimi's, tears immediately filled them. For several painful seconds, neither woman moved. Then, unexpectedly, Madame Ronke walked slowly toward her. Journalists leaned forward instantly. The old woman stopped directly before Oluwadarasimi and lowered herself painfully onto her knees. Gasps spread across the courtroom. "Mama," Oluwadarasimi whispered in shock. But Madame Ronke was already crying openly now. "I wronged you," she whispered brokenly. "I wronged my son." The courtroom remained completely silent. "I threw you away when you needed family," the old woman continued through tears. "And I believed lies instead of love." Oluwadarasimi felt her own tears returning immediately. Madame Ronke looked toward little Ayomide. "My grandson." Her voice cracked painfully. "I nearly allowed evil to destroy him too. For several seconds, nobody breathed. Then finally, the old woman bowed her head completely. "Forgive me." The words shattered something inside Oluwadarasimi emotionally, because hatred suddenly felt exhausting now. Heavy, pointless. Tunde would never return. But perhaps pain did not need to continue destroying everyone forever. Slowly, Oluwadarasimi reached forward and helped Madame Ronke stand again. The older woman cried even harder afterward, not from humiliation, from relief. Meanwhile, across the courtroom, Jide watched silently from the back row. He wore a dark suit again, calm as always, but his injured arm remained bandaged beneath the fabric. Nobody approached him directly. Even now, fear followed him naturally, but today, something else followed too. Respect. Because without Jide Kosoko, the truth about Tunde's death would likely have remained buried forever. Yet despite the victory surrounding him, Jide looked strangely distant, quiet, almost detached emotionally. Later that evening, after the court session ended, Oluwadarasimi finally found him alone outside near the parking area overlooking the Lagos skyline. The wind moved softly through the city, while distant traffic hummed below. "You disappeared after the hearing," she said quietly. Jide kept his eyes on the city lights. "The important part is finished." "No," she answered softly. "Not for me." He finally looked toward her then. For several seconds, silence passed between them naturally. Then Oluwadarasimi noticed the small travel bag resting beside his car. Fear entered her chest immediately. "You're leaving." Jide did not deny it. "The police will continue investigating my own operations now." His voice remained calm. "This city becomes dangerous for people around me. You protected us. I also destroyed people. The honesty hurt." Oluwadarasimi stepped closer slowly. "You think one good act cannot matter because of your past?" Jide smiled faintly without happiness. "You don't know my past. Maybe not. But I know what you chose recently." He looked away briefly. "Men like me don't get peaceful endings." The sentence carried genuine belief, not drama, not self-pity, just truth shaped by a lifetime of violence. Oluwadarasimi suddenly understood something heartbreaking. Jide genuinely believed he was beyond redemption. "Tunde believed you could change," she whispered. Whispered. His jaw tightened slightly. Tunde believed impossible things, and he was usually right. Silence returned again. Then, unexpectedly, Ayomide began crying softly from the back seat where Mama Bisola waited nearby. Both turned instinctively toward the sound. For one brief moment, Jide's face softened completely while looking at the child. Not fearsome, not powerful, just human. Oluwadarasimi noticed immediately. "You care about him," Jide answered quietly. "He deserves a life untouched by men like me." The sentence finally broke her patience. "No," she whispered firmly. "He deserves a life surrounded by people who chose to protect him." Jide stared at her silently. Then, for the first time since they met, uncertainty appeared inside his eyes. Real uncertainty. Because perhaps redemption frightened him more than violence ever had. And somewhere deep inside herself, Oluwadarasimi realized something too. Healing was not simply about surviving pain. Sometimes healing meant choosing hope again, even after fear taught you not to trust it. 6 months later, the old Adebayo mansion no longer looked like a place built by greed. Children's laughter now echoed through hallways, once filled with secrets and betrayal. Women carrying babies sat together beneath the large garden trees, sharing food prayers and painful stories of survival. Former guest rooms had become temporary shelters for widows escaping abuse, abandonment, and violence. And above the main entrance, a new sign stood proudly beneath the Lagos sunlight. The Tunde Adebayo Foundation for Women and Children. Oluwadarasimi stood near the front steps holding Ayomide, while watching volunteers distribute food packages across the courtyard. Peace still felt unfamiliar sometimes, but slowly She was learning how to live without fear, controlling every breath. Ayomide had grown healthier too. His laughter came easily now, especially whenever Mama Bisola chased him playfully around the garden carrying toys or snacks. The older woman herself had become the heart of the foundation. Everyone called her Mama without hesitation. And somehow, despite everything, healing had quietly entered their lives. Not suddenly, not magically, but day by day, choice by choice. Meanwhile, the legal consequences surrounding the Adebayo scandal continued unfolding publicly across Nigeria. Chief Bode Balogun received multiple prison sentences connected to corruption, weapons trafficking, and conspiracy surrounding Tunde's murder. Several politicians fell beside him during the investigations. Femi remained cold even during sentencing, but Kunle eventually confessed fully, not because he hoped for freedom anymore, because guilt finally destroyed him completely. Madame Ronke visited Tunde's grave almost every week now. Sometimes she stayed there for hours, speaking softly through tears no one else heard. Grief had humbled her permanently, and though she could never erase what she did to Oluwadarasimi, she spent the rest of her days trying to become softer than the woman pain once turned her into. One warm Saturday afternoon, Oluwadarasimi walked slowly through the renovated mansion, carrying donation records while volunteers prepared for a community outreach event. The building itself felt transformed emotionally. Rooms once controlled by fear now sheltered vulnerable women. The office where Femi once planned corruption had become a free legal clinic, and Tunde's old bedroom remained untouched, except for fresh flowers placed beside his photograph every morning. Some memories deserved protection. As Oluwadarasimi passed through the courtyard, she noticed several women speaking quietly near the entrance. Then suddenly they smiled respectfully and stepped aside. Jide stood near the gate. For a moment, Oluwadarasimi simply stared, because after the court hearings months earlier, he disappeared completely. No calls, no messages, only silence. Yet somehow, part of her never truly believed he was gone forever. Jide looked different now, still calm, still carrying quiet danger naturally, but something softer existed in his face too. The constant tension inside his eyes had faded slightly. Ayomide saw him first. The little boy immediately stretched out his tiny hands excitedly. Jihi shouted happily in baby language. Oluwadarasimi laughed softly despite herself. Jide stepped closer slowly. "He remembers me. You saved his life." For several seconds, neither knew what to say next. Then finally, Jide handed her a small envelope. "What is this documents?" He looked away briefly. "I transferred several properties connected to my old operations." Oluwadarasimi frowned slightly while opening the papers. "These are worth millions. They'll fund the shelters permanently." She looked up sharply. "You're giving this away?" Jide nodded once. "I spent too many years building things that destroyed lives." Silence settled between them again. Then Oluwadarasimi noticed something else. For the first time since meeting him, there were no armed men surrounding him, no bodyguards, no visible weapons. "You changed," she whispered. Jide smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm trying." The honesty touched her deeply, because change did not come easily to wounded people, especially men like Jide. Mama Bisola suddenly appeared near the doorway carrying trays of food. The older woman stopped immediately after seeing him. "Well," she said knowingly, the stubborn man finally came back. Jide laughed quietly under his breath. A real laugh this time, not cold, not forced, human. Later that evening, the foundation hosted a public memorial event honoring Tunde's life and the reopening of the shelter officially. Dozens of women gathered across the courtyard beneath glowing lights, while local musicians played soft instrumental music nearby. Journalists attended too, but tonight felt less about scandal and more about healing. As sunset painted Lagos gold and orange, Oluwadarasimi stepped onto the small outdoor stage, carrying Ayomide in her arms. The crowd slowly quieted. For several seconds she simply looked around the courtyard, at the women once abandoned like her, at the children laughing nearby, at Mama Bisola smiling proudly through tears, and finally, at Jide standing silently near the back. Then she began speaking. "When my husband died," she said softly, "I thought my life ended too." The crowd listened quietly. "I lost my home, my family rejected me, powerful people tried destroying my child before he even understood the world." Her voice trembled briefly, but pain taught me something important. She looked toward the women sitting closest to the stage. No woman should suffer alone simply because she becomes vulnerable. Several women wiped tears quietly. Oluwadarasimi continued. Tunde believed kindness mattered even when the world rewarded cruelty. She smiled sadly. This foundation exists because his heart refused to become hard. Applause spread gently across the courtyard. Then she looked toward Ayomide. "And this child will grow up knowing his father died protecting truth." The crowd applauded louder this time, but Oluwadarasimi's eyes eventually found Jide again, and softly, carefully, she added one final sentence. "Sometimes God sends help through people the world fears misunderstanding." Jide lowered his eyes briefly afterward, because deep inside himself he understood exactly what she meant. Hours later, after the guests finally left and the courtyard became quiet again, Oluwadarasimi stood alone near the garden, where soft lights glowed beneath the trees. Jide approached slowly. "You honored Tunde beautifully," he said quietly. "He deserved that." "Yes." Silence settled naturally between them. Comfortable now, not painful. Then Oluwadarasimi turned toward him fully. "Are you leaving again?" Jide hesitated. "I don't know." She smiled softly. "For once in your life, maybe stop running from peace." The sentence reached somewhere deep inside him, and for the first time in many years, Jide Kosoko allowed himself to imagine something impossible, a future not built on fear. Nearby, Ayomide's laughter echoed through the garden, while Mama Bisola chased him gently beneath the lights. And somewhere beyond the noise of Lagos, beyond grief, betrayal, and violence, hope quietly survived. After all the pain Oluwadarasimi endured, one truth remained stronger than betrayal. Kindness still matters in this world. Greed destroyed powerful men, but compassion rebuilt broken lives. Tunde's love survived beyond death, through the people he protected, and even wounded souls like Jide discovered that redemption becomes possible when someone finally believes they are worth saving. Life often changes without warning. Families fail each other, good people suffer unfairly, and sometimes the world rewards cruelty for far too long. But healing begins the moment we choose not to let pain turn our hearts cold. Oluwadarasimi could have become consumed by revenge. Instead, she transformed suffering into shelter, protection, and hope for others. That is the kind of strength the world rarely celebrates enough. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories about justice, healing, faith, and second chances still matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional African stories that remind us humanity can survive even the darkest moments. Da Juan Tut Kichban.